Okay, so the title of my paper is ever so slightly modified from how it appears in your programs, which shouldn't make too much of a difference. But the title I have now is Thinking About Digitality, Islam and Muslimness, a Schema. This paper is something of a schema for thinking through some of the issues surrounding the question of digitality and Islam and Muslimness. It's based on my study of Islam and Muslimness in the digital sphere for over 5 years, probably longer actually. It is my intention that this paper will provide a framework for me and hopefully others to think about the problem of Islam and Muslimness in the digital sphere. This paper builds on my essay, which was mentioned before, Thinking About Islam, Politics and Muslim Identity in a Digital Age, published in the Journal of Islamic and Muslim Studies, in which I argue that since digitality emerges, as I contend, from a Western Eurocentric Weltanschauung, it follows that the digital sphere tacitly rejects Islam and Muslims, where Islam and Muslims are the archetypal other of the West. Digitality is a continuation, I argue in that essay, of Orientalism or Eurocentric power knowledge, or a Eurocentric power knowledge project of continued global domination. Given Eurocentrism's inherent racism, given digitality's omnipresence, and given that Islamophobia is this is arguable, paradigmatic example of racism, it is inevitable that there will be more, this is what I argue in that essay, there will be more and more anti-Islamic / anti-Muslim sentiments throughout the world. I argue further in that essay that politics in the digital age are reconfigured to fit specific parameters preordained by the digital sphere, and concurrently ideas around Islam and Muslimness, whether according to the wider social media landscape or by Muslim actors themselves, are also significantly reshaped by digitality. It is my guiding assumption here and previously that historic Islam, and I'm sort of taking a Said Hossein Nasr approach as opposed over and above a sort of Shahab Ahmed approach. It is my guiding assumption that historic Islam was and is a complex yet unified, based on the idea of Tawheed, metaphysical system geared towards the creation of subjects that are interconnected for the sake of recreating our fundamental connection with the divine, based on which we live and breathe and die. However, in the context of digitality, this complex metaphysical system must be radically broken up into tiny packets, which are the basic mode of transfer of information in the digital sphere, and as such, the human subject itself is broken up into disconnected packets of experience that are almost impossible to be made to cohere. This is my argument here, which it's a different take on things as compared to many of the papers today. As such, the Islamic subject in the digital sphere, or any subject in the digital sphere for that matter, is marked by a state of being that becomes a hodgepodge of features that are well nigh impossible to bring together in an integrated whole. Thus, it's my contention that the idea of digital Islam, where Islam and Muslimness are understood in a historic sense as mentioned above, is an oxymoron. So what are Muslims to do? I think this is a question that has to be seriously pondered by all people of faith within their respective faith traditions, as well as people of no faith background, insofar as the virtuous life, in the Aristotelian sense, where virtue is about giving various aspects of life and living their due, is a process of attaining to greater and greater holism and integration. Now, like most of you present here today, and this is an assumption here, I find it hard to live without the internet. I owe the magic of the digital sphere a great deal, and it is indeed quite magical, let us be under no illusions, insofar as magic in everyday parlance has the ability to dazzle, to astound, to trick, and to confound. I often remark, have done, that I wrote my entire doctoral dissertation based on research I did on the internet. Now, that remark, while not entirely accurate, nevertheless captures something of the point I'm making. I certainly could not have written my dissertation if it were not for the internet, or at least my dissertation would certainly have looked very different if it were not for digitality. What does this mean as far as how I am in the world? What does this mean as far as my sense of being? What does this mean as far as my sense of myself? What does this mean as far as my sense of wholeness, to use a somewhat non-academic but nevertheless useful word? Despite my utter reliance on the internet, on so many things digital, from books to videos to lectures to animal videos, I have serious misgivings about digitality, which I define in my aforementioned published article, as a mode of being in the world that is mediated through the very reality of the digital sphere. Digitality, on the one hand, makes it possible to attain to hitherto unattainable levels of knowledge and creativity and connectivity, while in the same breath it appears to make older, one might say more holistic, to use another not so academically sexy yet nonetheless useful word, modes of learning and creating and connecting almost obsolete, or at the very least less and less tenable. When was the last time any of us used library cards to find books in the library? When was the last time any of us wrote a paper using a pencil or pen and pad? When was the last time any of us used smoke signals? Okay, so I'm being somewhat facetious with the last example, but there is a serious point I'm trying to convey. There's something very human, something necessarily human in the materiality of the above examples as far as I'm concerned. I think we lose out on something of our essential selves when we progressively eliminate the material conditions of our living and acting and interacting in the world. And by essential, I mean a sense of selfhood that is somehow integrated and able to integrate into itself. This idea of an integrative self is what all the wisdom traditions propound, as far as I can tell. Yes, creating technologies that make it more friction-free, seamless in today's parlance, to do things, whether it be to learn or to write or to communicate, to stay within those three modalities for now, make it an awful lot smoother and simpler to get things done. At the same time, the progressive smoothing of the interfaces, to use another one of those buzzwords, is not without its price. Nothing ever is. Nicholas Carr noted in his 2011 Pulitzer Prize-nominated book, The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains, that, and he argues that the internet is literally reshaping our brains to the point that we find it less and less easy to concentrate, less and less easy to learn, less and less easy to be in a more settled and grounded sense. What does all this portend as far as the creation of an Islamic subject? If being Muslim in the ideal sense is something like being a whole person who is able to see God wheresoever she or he turns, Surah Baqarah, verse 115, I'm referring to there, then I don't think at all that digitality is conducive to Islam and Muslimness in that metaphysical sense. I'm being kind of a little extreme in my pronouncements here, and consciously so. If, however, Islam is whatever Muslims say it is, as has been the conceit of anthropologists for some time now, and my advisor at Columbia, when I did my PhD there, is an anthropologist, so I take anthropologists' reading things very seriously. If we take that conceit to heart, then of course digital Islam is just another manifestation of Islam in a long series of manifestations of Islam. But I'm not entirely convinced. David Hume famously enunciated the difference between the is and the ought, and that the ought, an ideal system of values, let's say, cannot be derived from the material facts, the is on the ground. Now, a little bit about, this is a small reflection on this site that I think about. Saeed Mustafa Ali is one of the founders of the closed Facebook group, as well as the website that derives from discussions in that group called Decolonial Islamic Studies. Ali is a lecturer in the School of Computing and Communications at the Open University in the UK. In 2013, I think it was 2013, we both presented on a panel I happened to have organized at the 10th Annual Conference of the International Society for the Study of Religion, Nature and Culture, where we individually spoke on AI and transhumanism, another two of my obsessions. So I have had occasion to interact with Ali until he unfriended me on Facebook and also removed me from the Facebook group soon after, and this is how I'm reading the situation, soon after my conversion to Christianity, which is a really long story as to how that came about, all of which is a discussion for another time, perhaps. But for now, I'll mention, and my conversion experience happened in 2016, but for now, I'll mention that such modalities of exclusion, interestingly enough, suggest to me that excommunication, in the old religious sense, continues in interesting new ways. I mention Ali really in connection with the discussions in the Facebook group, as well as the website. Ali and his fellow discussants are of the opinion that a decolonial Islamic studies is not only possible, but that it is also adamantly desirable. Ali has even gone so far as to argue that it's necessary to have a decolonial internet. It is my contention, however, that the idea of a decolonial Islamic studies, let alone a decolonial internet, is impossible. Why do I say this? Knowledge is always produced and thought through certain background assumptions. There is a massive, albeit essentially invisible, framework that holds together the articulations made in any given system. And for all intents and purposes, the system that has been in place for some centuries now, for better and for worse, has been a Eurocentric power knowledge system. Colonialism, of course, made this possible. I don't have the space to go into all the arguments around the unconscious construction of knowledge through modern Western paradigms of thought, which forms the backdrop of much of my work. What I will mention here is Foucault's idea of the unconscious of knowledge, according to which knowledge in every age is thought through certain paradigmatic assumptions. Hence to say that we can have a decolonial Islamic studies when the very creation of Islamic studies was a colonial enterprise is nonsensical as far as I can tell. It's all very paradoxical, of course, unless we overhaul the system completely. As far as a decolonial internet, which the Decolonial Islamic Studies group is also implicitly trying to bring about and is arguing for a decolonial Islamic studies through the medium of the internet, I think that's also an impossibility. Why do I say this? The assumption that far too many people have is that the internet is a neutral technology. How often do we hear that? And that all we need to do is make proper use of it. I don't mean any disrespect to anyone who may have suggested that today, but I'm not convinced by that. I do not accept this philosophically naive assumption. There is no such thing as a neutral technology, ever. The creators of each and every tool and technology throughout history have always imbued their creations with their guiding assumptions, whether consciously or, more often than not, unconsciously. Some of the guiding assumptions of digitality off the top of my head are: 1, that human beings are discrete individuals fundamentally separate from one another as opposed to being metaphysically connected, such that a person's being is not separate from the rest of society or from the rest of the cosmos, even. 2, that human beings are essentially consumers. This is the assumption of digitality. And that their lives are geared towards the fulfillment of their consumer needs. That human beings, 3, that human beings live and breathe for the sake of their appetitive fulfillment, for the sake of their animal selves, from an Aristotelian or even a Ghazalian point of view. 4, that while all people are equal, some are more equal than others. Of course, we see also racism, very deep racism in Silicon Valley, which doesn't get talked about, and sexism, of course. The great media therapist, interesting slip, the great media theorist, Marshall McLuhan, maybe he's also a therapist in some ways, observed that the presence of television cameras on the football field historically opened up the game in ways that previously wasn't possible. With the presence of television cameras, players were now required to perform their sport in ways that was simply not thinkable prior to the arrival of cameras on the field. Of course, the pre-television reality that McLuhan alluded to is almost entirely beyond our ken today, and it's as if it didn't exist. Technology has a strange way of doing that. It creates a radical break with the past, to the point that the past becomes unthinkable, to the point of non-existence almost. What happens when Islam, which I've described above as a complex, integrative, metaphysical system, is spliced up and opened up and reorganized and packeted up as a result of digitality? I believe that what we have left is something very far from an integrative tradition. What we have, I think, is just another mode in a countless series of modes of digitality. Here are some further brief reflections before I conclude on this issue. I was speaking to Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, earlier this year, about the manner in which people tend to learn these days. And Stiglitz pointed out that people tend to learn in bits and pieces on the internet, and he found it very hard to learn that way. He said that he prefers to learn through more traditional means, such as books, of course. Now, Stiglitz's point is not an insignificant one, although some may read it as the musings of an older academic on the sad state of affairs of the youth today. As has been pointed out by who, I couldn't quite remember who it was exactly, but the nature of digital platforms is such that people become more concerned with the platform itself, with the sort of funny, interesting, smooth working of the platform itself, than with actual content so much. This quality of the internet is part of its very structure, due to its use of hypertext and hyperlinks. How often do you find yourself getting stuck into the proverbial rabbit hole that is the very sum and substance of the internet? And how much learning do we achieve? Learning that might be considered meaningful and in depth. As far as the ideas of Islam and Muslimness, here are some final implications as far as I can tell. To be Muslim through and because of digitality is a mode of being that entails a disharmonious cobbling together of concepts and memes and clicks and bytes and images and videos and likes and comments and tweets and notifications and emails and GIFs and suggestions and sound bites and ads and animal videos. I think you're beginning to get my point. Into an idea of a whole person, an idea of a Muslim, or a person of any faith tradition. I happen to be Eastern Orthodox today, who is supposedly practicing her religion with a sort of wholeness and presence of mind, khushu', that is expected of her according to the lofty ideals of the historic tradition she considers herself to be a part of. And yet, as far as I can tell, digitality, whose presence is ubiquitous and ever deepening, is fundamentally concerned with the fashioning of ideal consumer subjects whose overarching motivations are necessarily not concerned with metaphysical ideas which are above the physical realm. The Muslim subject created through digitality is therefore, like all other digital subjects, one whose being is only at a surface level concerned with the deeper questions of her metaphysical tradition. For the crucial fact that digitality does not permit the creation of deeply metaphysically engaged subjects, but rather with subjects that are ever-changeable, impressionable, manipulable, and, in the final analysis, fungible. Thank you.